That is the question.
Welcome to Varn blog. No, this is not patrons only. This is Excavations. So the public will hear this.
Where am I? What is this? How did I get here?
Watching the days go by, reading Hal Draper from 1947. All right.
That's like a really good mashup.
All right. So we begin today on this public episode of Not Patrons Only Excavations with our continuing discussion. We find the title of this essay. We've read this for so long, even though it's only like 25 pages or something.
And now we've started to just go like 2 by 2 in sections.
Right. It seems like it's much, much longer because we were also reading, and this is a patron's ad, I guess, a book Behind the Patron Wall where we've gotten like 250 pages into dense history stuff in the same time period.
Yeah, as 5 episodes of each so far.
As we've gotten 5 episodes into a 20-page essay by Hal Draper. But this is from Hal Draper's 1947 polemic. It was originally published in the New International, Volume 13, Number 9, in December, and reprinted in International Socialism Series 1, November 15th, 1963-1964, in a slightly abridged fashion, and republished in the Marxist Internet Archive in July 2008. It is called The Inevitability of Socialism, a much abused formula. I think that's the first time I've actually gone through the whole publication history of this piece, but yes. We are now in the section called The Historical Inevitability of Socialism. One would assume, since this is named after the essay, that it's important.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty fair assessment. I feel like we've kind of gotten into the heart of it in the last episode and now. And there were moments when I was reading for this recording where I'm like, couldn't we have just said this part a little bit sooner? But yeah. Let's get to that part.
All right. Starting. The understanding of the Marxist formulas is essential context for understanding the meaning of the inevitability of socialism in light of Marxist method. Marxist here is just a capitalized noun. I think that's interesting because basically his argument on formulas is that they are not actually formulas.
They're generalizations and they're things that we should avoid dogmatizing and fetishizing and etherizing upon a table and then shoving into little formaldehyde jars.
He does make the formaldehyde reference. One thing I would say about this is that I think he actually does more damage to the idea of Marx's rules of history than he realizes in that section. And I don't disagree with his argument, but it also just means that, like, well, we have these formulas, but they're really just rules that are for specific historical time periods. So take them with a grain of salt. And I'm like, okay, this is something I get mad at Lukács for doing too, because I'm like, you on one hand, you're talking about Marxist or Marx's, depending on who you're talking about, methodology. Mm-hmm. He's talking about Marxist, not Marx's. So I will give him that credit. On the other hand, you empty the methodology of any content. Like,
also true.
Yeah, without it, one is doomed to oscillate between the fatalistic view of inedibility on one hand and the other conclusion that all we can do is speak of the socialist perspective in terms of varying degrees of possibility or probability. I'm just going to point out this is an excluded middle fallacy.
Yeah, but those are exactly the two things that he spent all of his time explaining up until now. And we've been asking all along, like, maybe there's something else. So, yeah. Talk about oscillating between the two things. That's what we've been doing in this essay.
Which, to give him some, like, formal credit, he's basically done what he's complaining about to illustrate the problem.
Certainly, yes.
Right. It's not just being a hypocrite here. Not that hypocrisy is ever really an argument. What we have to do here is fill out the formula, the inevitability of socialism. If it is objected that we are reading something into it, then we have explained in vain why the very nature of formulas that this must continually be done. Easy to see first is that the fact inevitability of socialism is not even a formula. that's fair enough.
Not even the complete formula, rather.
Yeah, not even the complete formula.
We're not just talking like about is socialism
Right.
inevitable.
Trotsky's passage indicated this at least. The Marxist concept is that of the historic inevitability of socialism. Hooke correctly filled out the term. The difference should be readily appreciated on the basis of our previous discussion of the operation and causes in different fields.
Podcat screaming.
Historical inevitability means the inevitable on the basis of the social historic causes and tendencies operating. This should rid us of one of those Riseacre who thinks that he has refuted Marx's concept when he asks, is socialism still inevitable if a wandering star crosses into our sun and wipes out the solar system? Or some similar sticker, usually astronomical or geological in nature. The trouble with this kind of annihilator of Marxism is that it shares the Johnson interpretation of inevitability and cannot stomach it. The distinction we have made is the valid kernel Trotsky's distinction, inescapable in the historical sense. So we're limiting the claim to a historical claim, not a geological or astronomical claim, although technically both would be historical claims or future historical claims.
Potentially be history ending as well. So.
Right. I mean, I'm being asinine here because he's being kind of very, very strict, and I want to point out that some of his strict delineations aren't entirely. I mean, they.
Are you being a wiseacre?
No, I'm not. I'm indicating that like his delineations on one hand like make kind of common sense uses, but he's trying to strictly delineate them. On the other hand, if you do strictly delineate them, like actually geology is a historical claim. Like astronomy exists in history, thus you were making historical claims about the likelihood of an astronomical event. What I think we can just imply because of common language stuff is he means human history, and that's all he's really concerned with.
Which is weird because much earlier on he talks about what was it, like a Peloponnesian War or something like that, which was won or lost because of weather patterns. That's clearly not.
Yeah, you can't actually separate human history from astronomical history, but
it's not historical in his definition.
But I think what he means is like we all know that when Marxists say this, it's an asterisk, this is some kind of non-social economic natural force destroys the earth. We're not really worried about that because that was going to happen on any system, right? Maybe. But I do get that like the distinction, even from the way he's laid it out, doesn't entirely work. All right. We must now examine what it means to juxtapose these two words, inevitable tendency. Actually, that is funny because inevitable tendency is kind of, they're almost contradictory. It's like,
it sounds like a contradiction in terms. So it's important what he goes on to do here.
Does one cancel the other? That is it true that as soon as we speak of a tendency, we can no longer speak of inevitability? In a strict sense, yes, but no. Not at all. In fact, the assertion of inevitability by human beings can only be an assertion about precisely an inevitable tendency.
Tendency.
Yeah.
He likes this word tendency. Tendency is an interesting thing to bring up.
This is a word though that's used a lot in Marx. Marx uses like the law of the tendency of the rate of profit, the fall, which people will also point out, well, law and tendency are contradictory.
Right. And he goes on to clarify just what purpose tendency is playing here. But like it does bring up, we'll get into these questions really shortly, but like tendencies sound relativistic, right? Like historical.
Yeah.
What about laws? So if you have a law with a tendency inside, law sounds like something which is transhistorical, which is universalistic.
Right. Well, plus there's just all kinds of ambiguity and even in the scientific use of law. So, for example, like germ theory is also pretty much a law, and a theory is codified into what we can call laws. Natural laws are like theoretical tendencies that we can observe with enough frequency to say that they are are transhistorical or not in a specific instance. But if you get really strict about it, if you go Humean on it,
Yeah, I was gonna
um,
exactly bring up that. What
you
are we
can't
talking about?
make natural
Humean or
laws at all.
non-Humean natural laws?
Right. Like after Hume, like there's a like Hume actually cast doubt on induction, and all these are based on induction or abduction. And I'm not
Mm-hmm.
going to get into abduction today, and he doesn't either. But abduction was a way. It was kind of a mid-century, early 20th century, early to mid 20th century way around the induction deduction problem, because deduction things are always true, but they're always true definitionally. They could like they're always true logically, but they can be wrong. Like you can be deductively correct and completely factually wrong.
What's useful about that then?
It's a way to test if a statement has meaning.
Interesting.
So if something is deductively wrong, it's usually just not a meaningful statement. Like it's not a set of propositions that one could actually like meaningfully say. For example, I'm trying to think of something that's deductively wrong. Well, for example, uh all men are blue. Um,
Because the Blue Man Group is full of 3 men and all 3 of them are blue.
well, yeah. No, that's actually, but I'm trying to think of how to actually say this in terms of predicate logic. All men are
Just buying you
blue.
time. Come on.
No women are blue. Therefore, Jared is blue. Jared is a man.
Okay.
Well, it's false, but the reasoning is sound deductively.
Got you. Yeah. Fair enough.
All right. Okay. Where's that? Oh, this is precisely an inevitable tendency. It applies with full force to so-called laws of our exact sciences. It is only to the popular science layman that they describe what must happen. Scientists themselves are more aware that what they describe are forces or casual factors acting in certain directions and inevitability tending to bring about the given result. The law of gravity does not assert that what comes up must come down. It simply says that what goes up will inevitably tend to come down.
And this is interesting because the first thing that popped into my mind here was sending a rocket into space, and I mean, this is well before we'd gotten to the moon. So
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff in here that I'm like, well, there's like, we still don't really understand how gravitation works exactly. I mean, maybe one of my physicist friends can correct me, but even when I took physics in college, they were like, we don't really know like why gravitational force works the way it does. It gets weaker and weaker the further out you are from centrifugal force, but it isn't centrifugal force, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I thought that Einstein had kind of
Einstein had figured out
hammered
more
some
rules of
that.
its operation and its relationship to the way we understand time, but I don't think he
Okay.
actually figured out how gravity truly worked. He just figured
Interesting.
out that Newtonian calculations aren't true for time. Again, that's my scientific layman understanding of someone who's had like 2 physics courses in my life. So I know I have engineers that finish this to listen to this show. They like to remind me all the time that they listen to this show, whenever I like slightly misstate a scientific fact, which I do appreciate, even if sometimes I get a little annoyed by it.
Thank you. We don't want non-pedantic engineers in the world, though. That would lead to things falling apart real fast.
So if I'm misstating an understanding, physicists, feel free to correct me.
And just comments. Philosophers of science as well. Pipe up in the comments.
Although I've had much more classes on those than I have on physics. Okay.
The same is true of Marxist formulas. Thus, the law of the fall in the rate of profit becomes, in the hands of careful Marxist economists, the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, etc. Again, our sectarians at the time of the Spanish Civil War, call back to last episode, might have managed to understand Marxism if they had read their pet formula, the character of the class in power tends to determine the character of the war. It will be seen that the use of inevitable in connection with the word tendency, first of all, asserts the existence of determinate causes behind the tendency. If anything, the objection can be made that inevitable tendency is not contradictory, but quite the opposite, tautological. For does not every tendency stem from determinate causes?
This is an
False.
equivocation.
Yeah.
I actually like, yeah. This is one of those things where I'm like, yeah, man, I'm not sure that you're actually correct on that. Because, for example, the law of gravity always working assumes that the law of gravity always works unless there's some other contingent factor that, like, it gets caught, like what goes up gets caught on a tree, or what goes up goes beyond our gravity. Now that we have a post, moon landing understanding of space,
Sure. Getting out
what
of the atmosphere and
yeah,
all of
you're out of the centrifugal force of the atmosphere, and thus gravity gets weaker and weaker, and you're not going to come back down. But maybe you will if you get caught back in that gravity pool again, or maybe you get caught in something else's gravity pool.
and then fall down over there. Yeah.
Right. Um, so, but that's different from, we know this is inevitable, but not. One of the things that's coming up a lot in other interviews I'm doing is this debate around whether or not Marx is a linear, like he believes in that socialism is inevitable because if society survives, it has to be socialistic. That's the next stage in evolution. And while he doesn't believe it in a purely linear developmental forces way, like the difference between a Hegelian understanding of that and a linear Whiggish understanding of that is like minor. There is a difference. Like, so the linear understanding, aka what I sometimes consider the G.A. Cohen understanding, is this where there's this constant transhistorical need to develop, and we just build and build and build, and the next thing and ever is the next thing. The Hegelian way of understanding that is there are tendencies in society that contradict. This contradicts moves you to a new phase, and figuring out the contradiction, because you have to overcome the initial negation for society to function. This moves forward towards some new thing. What makes Marx different from Hegel is that Marx assumes that this is coming from material inputs, not from some absolute ideal that we are building towards. Okay. And Marx does have a conception of regression. That's clear when he talks about Bonapartism and other things, which he kind of ad hocs to, like, he's constantly revising the theory when the conditions don't go the way he says. But in a way, from a like for all of Marx's claim to science, and man, Marx is gonna get mad when I say this, but like that's not a scientific way to reason. Like that's actually like, okay, I have a stated standpoint that must be true. This is not happening. I have to come up with some countervailing counter tendency to explain it. But that's post hoc logic.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is if you have to do that a lot, it means you don't actually have, like, your rule is not a rule at all.
Right.
So like this is why I think Draper's doing a lot kind of rhetorically with the rhetoric of science here, and he does seem to understand science fairly well for 1947.
Mm-hmm.
But some of this is polemical in a
Like a lot of
way.
it. Yeah,
Yeah,
certainly. And especially in these sections that we're reading. And
right.
they're masked in something which is asserting a very scientific understanding.
Right, because inevitable tendency is not tautological. Inevitable, even in the way he's stating inevitable and tendency, do not mean the same thing. Like they're not. They're also not contradictory, but he's operating here by excluding a middle. That, like,
Mm-hmm.
well, the words have slightly different meanings, but they sometimes can be used in tandem, and sometimes will be contradictory. And he's just like, well, no, they're the same thing, really. Like, and that's a very strictly rationalist approach to language, but it's a problematic one. But let us continue. I mean,
Yes.
for people who think we're being hard on Draper, I like Draper. This is
Oh
just,
yeah, great great essay.
well, I
Nice.
also think like this gets to something that I told you way back why I want to talk about this is like these debates, which were really crucial to early Marxism, get dropped in the 1950s and we just pretend they never happened. We're
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, socialism isn't inevitable. It's one of many possibilities. Bye-bye. Like,
Sure, and this could easily be written off as some sort of inter-Trotskyist,
right.
factional warfare, which it is to a certain degree.
It is, but
yeah.
he's actually arguing with people who are like, in this instance, the Burnham, the not the Burnham faction, the Canaanite faction is making
Mhm.
the same argument as the Marxist-Leninists would be making. They would actually be making an identical argument here.
Yeah, and he's trying to throw a lot of shade, for lack of better word, on
Right.
how a lot of their concepts square up with bureaucratic collectivism.
Right. All right. The meaning of an inevitable tendency. Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Here we run again into the difference between objective inevitability and the relativity of human knowledge. Thus, Professor Morris Raphael Cohen, because Morris R. Cohen, in a different connection, cites the example of the correlation of 87% between membership of the International, really American, Mechanics Union and the death rate of the state of Hyderabad in India.
Yeah, in India.
Hyderabad for India, for a period of 12 years. This tendency, however, was not the result of any operative cause linking up the two phenomenon. In other words, it was accidental. Yet Morris is actually doing like a very basic logical clarification of you cannot say correlation is causation.
Sure.
You can say correlation may imply causation if you can find causal mechanisms.
Sure. But I have another issue with this, and again, assuming that this is being written as a polemic, as much as anything, the choice of the word accidental for correlation. Accident has its own connotations. Like, wouldn't we prefer maybe to use the word coincidental here?
Yeah, we might use coincidental. I think he's probably actually using the word that Morris Cohen would have used.
Mm-hmm. But he says correlation. Does he say accident?
Yeah, he probably does. I actually do not know. Because both tendency and accidental in quotation marks here. I don't know that, and actually he does not say
right
the precise text he's getting that from. He just attributes it to Morris Cohen.
Right.
So I can't go and check it. Just to put that out there.
Sure.
In the field of history, there are also tendencies set up by non-historic, aka accidental, we would now say contingent, factors which may be temporary and doomed to peter out and disappear. The tendency towards socialism, however, inevitably arises from the conditions of man's social progress, such as contrasts of nature.
Breaks.
Conquest
of nature.
Your Sato is going to come out here.
Exactly. What are we, Promethean all of a sudden? What are we trying to conquest nature, or are we trying to live harmoniously with nature and man in a balanced metabolism, a la Marx and Capital?
Well, maybe. I have
Find
to
out more in our Sato series in the Patreon paywall.
There are times where I agree with Sato, but think maybe Sato's like attributing to Marx more insight than he can. Remember when we talked about this on the Liebig thing? Again, this is all behind the paywall, but I'll say it here. Where like Sato's like, well, he really kind of figures out what the problems with Liebig are, and also he corrects his thesis. But what Marx actually says is that he was right the whole time.
Yes.
So like Saito is actually interpreting Marx as changing his position without him saying it. Whereas I actually don't know for sure that Marx has completely changed his position. So anyway, for those of you who don't know, go read Patreon, or go read, if you don't want to subscribe to me, go read Kohei Saito's Karl Marx is Equal Socialism. And it's in the first chapter in section 2.
There you go.
All right. Yeah, the man's social progress towards the conquest of nature. There's so many assumptions in that, right? Like, one is that it assumed. I think that does assume progress is pretty much linear. And I'm like, societies fall apart all the time. Like, Like, this is the
Sure.
problem with the here be dragons of Marxism, where it's like, we're talking about European feudalism, transition to capitalism, and deducing everything from there. Everything else is either like ancient man, primitive historicism, Asiatic despotism, or whatever. And it's like, yeah, that's not actually all that useful. So-called primitive accumulation, and I think he may even say so-called Asiatic despotism. I don't remember. Because he's quoting someone else. This not only distinguishes a tendency towards socialism from the tendencies set up by non-historic factors, it also permits us to understand the distinction of socialism or fascism, or socialism or barbarism, in its relationship to the historical inevitability of socialism. True, the tendency towards fascism, we should see, is not set up by non-historic factors. Its causes are rooted in the field of society and history and the decay of modern capitalism. But on the basis of the Marxist analysis that there is all important difference between the tendency towards socialism and the admittedly existent tendency towards a slave state, fascism isn't a slave state.
No, and a slave state would be regressive,
Right.
would it not?
Yeah, it would be. And like, slave society is what Marx actually thinks predates, like, antique slave society predates feudal society.
Sure, that's exactly what I'm pointing to. There's a bunch of curious things at work here. Like, does humanity's social nature actually like preclude domination at all? Maybe
Right.
as in a slave state? Is that unnatural? Would that be unnatural to human nature because it's antisocial and we're
Right.
social by nature? What about war?
Yeah.
Is that not
Draper,
part of our nature? Is that contradictory?
I mean, it depends. Like, all these are going to be depending on how you define this, and this is where I think Draper's been fairly careful, but on this, like many Marxists, he jumps the rocks, like, because he's just asserting things that he can't really prove as base assumptions to get out of, like, well, this is what we mean when we say this because this is what human beings do, and I'm like, yeah, but you have to prove that human beings actually do that. Like, you're just assuming that, which makes all this inevitable historic stuff versus non-inevitable historic stuff a lot more precarious than you think.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I think saying a tendency towards fascism and an existent tendency towards a slave state is interesting, and is interesting because he's not framing it in terms of regression. If this latter is
But it
beaten
sounds like Trotsky does.
right, Trotsky does. Trotsky's a clear stagist. If this latter is beaten back by the definitive triumph of the proletariat and socialist revolution, then it is dead, consigned to the famous garbage heap of history. Except it's not, because we keep on having to refight these battles every time there's a large capitalist conflict. And
Yeah.
which I guess is why there's so many. I think this is why to get into other debates, why, like me, who takes a moderately strict definition of fascism, versus Danny Besner, who takes a very strict definition of fascism, versus most anarchists I know, which take a very loose definition of fascism, but which they usually just mean authoritarian.
Yeah.
We're all kind of always debating around this because we're like, well, this is a tendency that happens when there's some kind of crisis. Either, like, I tend to see authoritarian crises as problems of complexity, social failure, etc., and aren't unique to capitalism. Whereas fascism, I feel, is not just unique to capitalism; it's unique to a very specific period in capitalism. Like, it's, but there are things that are fascistic that have similar tendencies, but do not manifest in the same way,
right,
both before and after. So, like, for example, Danny Besner always talks about, like, he doesn't consider the Confederacy fascist. And I would also say it's not fascist. There are plenty of bad things that are not fascist.
sure.
However, it has fascistic tendencies because tendencies within the Confederacy, and actually within the Union too, were incorporated into fascist legal theory. Like,
Interesting.
So,
like what? Curious about that.
Well, for example, the concentration camps were based on the reservation policy.
Sure. Okay.
Nazi laws around like genetics were based on like racial codes in the southeastern United States. Like like this is documented. It's not just speculation. It's not just concurrence. It's like directly influenced.
Right.
There's other stuff though that this ignores because there's other parts of fascism and hitlerism, which I don't even consider really the same thing. This ignores, for example, fascist tends to be corporatistic. There's not actually corporatistic politics history in the United States. So there's not a mass call in the Confederacy for class collaboration. And in fact, like there's not really a developed industrial class in the Confederacy at all outside of a few cities. It's almost like Russia in that regard. The planter class operated on a capitalist market, and we can call it capitalist, but it also had strong aristocratic elements and justified itself on aristocratic lines. But the accumulation that occurred under the planter class's use of forced labor is part of how the transatlantic capital state plural, were born. So, like, this is a very complicated thing. And Marx himself seems to be somewhat ambivalent on whether or not to call capitalism in the South under the planter class capitalism or not. And ultimately, he does call it capitalism, but he calls it capitalism like a different type that has a more regressive and despotic nature. So, you know, this is all to say basically that, like, even for Marx, some of these categories during his lifetime, he struggled to figure out how certain even post-European societies fit into it. And this becomes even more ambivalent at the end of his life, as we kind of talked about. Like, that's where, like, everybody who wants to derive the hope that Marx is not like a inevitabilist or a Promethean or whatever have to go to late Marxist writings to do it. They have to go to like post 1860 writings. All right.
Indeed they do. Yeah. But yes, back to Draper on this, you know, big distinguishing difference between.
It seems pretty premature when fucking phalangism is even still around for another 30 years to say that fascism is dead, though. Like, even in 1947 context, that seems like a big leap.
Sure. And yeah, I don't know what it is like that he's drawing from here exactly. Like, first of all, we can talk pretty happily about the inevitability of socialism.
Well, here's another problem. Like, for example,
but what do you do with the inevitability of fascism to arise out of
which is not in Marx. Marx does not talk about fascism. He talks about Bonapartism.
Sure.
He talks about imperialism. He means, frankly, different things by both, depending on when he's saying them. Imperialism he often uses to refer to a Bonapartistic leader. More than the precise definition that Lenin puts behind it. Although sometimes he does mean the definition similar to what Lenin puts behind it, which is colonialism. So, like, it's not consistent. And yeah, I think we have to deal with that. I know I'm making a lot of the Marxist purists mad today by admitting that Marx is not consistent, to some of these inevitability arguments are unclear, etc. But I'm just stating what I've gotten from reading him for 20 years.
Right. He also doesn't clarify like why dead fascism wouldn't necessarily reanimate itself.
Well, here's the thing that I want to push back on. So the first, like, France is the bourgeois revolution, but the proto-bourgeois revolution and the birthplace of the capitalist nation state, although maybe not capitalism in Marx, because of that footnote where we know he says that capitalism was probably born in the Italian city-states because they got rid of the serfs first. We know that he thinks that the paradigmatic model of capitalism is the British Empire. He thinks the paradigmatic model of the capitalist revolution is the French Revolution, right? Or a bourgeois revolution. Maybe we shouldn't totally equate bourgeois and capitalist here. But here's the question. Feudal relations still exist to this day in England. our manorial relations are whatever. The largest landholders and the richest people in England are still aristocrats.
Sure, and the House of Lords still exists,
Right.
obviously.
It has less power, but yeah. Like, so even in the core of capitalism, we didn't even totally get rid of all the vestiges of feudalism. So why the fuck do you think we would have done that in 2 years with fascism when there's one para-fascist state, the Phalange of Spain, that's still around for another generation, basically?
Sure. I suppose that his argument would be because it wasn't defeated by the proletariat in the socialist revolution. But again, he's not
Again, why
going
not
to
though?
state, right.
Because the Soviet Union is one of the people doing the defeating. Like, we're not going to get into. I told you I discovered this in my history of Trotskyism, because I did not know this, but the Trotskyist internationals opposed, after Trotsky's death, opposed the entry of the United States into World War II.
Interesting. Why?
Because even though they were Soviet defenses, they thought a direct alliance with the foreign worker state was unjustifiable.
Curious. That's
and
a
that
really
it was
great
an
series.
inter-imperialist conflict,
Oh Lord.
which actually doesn't follow the logic of Trotsky in the Spanish Civil War either. But that,
Oh, what if they had thrown tendency into the sentence?
but I find this interesting because you will notice that Draper's not using any examples from their own stances in a recent war.
Which is curious because it's 1947.
Right.
You have a handful to choose from at this point.
It's like almost like he knows that the Trotskyist international take was bad, and it's just like ignoring it. Like,
Which it seems like that's something that he won't have an issue with confronting a little bit later on in his career, but at this point he still has his
right.
allegiances. I
Later on, he basically declares all these sects dead. Like,
yeah. I wonder if he would read some of this back to himself and not find whiffs of dogma.
I wonder too. The reason why I don't know is because this was republished in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming, since it was published in like International Socialist, which is the predecessor organization to the ISO, that it was done so with his consent. So, but I would love to know what he thought about that in the 80s or something.
Right.
Because I mean, he's still alive. I think he's still alive even when you're born. Like, he dies. I think he dies in either 1989 or 1990.
Okay.
Like, I know that his last works were published in 1990. The last two editions of Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution are both published, Volume 3 and Volume 4 in 1990. Yep, he dies January 23rd, 1990. So
that was right before I was born. Maybe his soul was recycled into my new baby girl body. Who knows?
Yeah, it wouldn't make that much sense. But I mean, I guess he was Jewish.
We already established that his last name was Dubinsky and mine is Dubin. So.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Yeah. See? So convincing.
It'd be interesting if you were related to him somehow.
I really wish. I also found out recently that Andrew Dice Clay is not a real Italian man from New York, but a Jewish guy with my grandmother's last name. And I was really hoping that we were related, but it's going to be hard to prove that one.
So there are 3 famous people I am related to, now that we're off topic. And one of them is Flannery O'Connor through my mom's Irish Catholic family. One of them is Mir Kahan.
Oh, wonderful. Yes, the Americana link. Who doesn't want that?
It is distant to my defense, but I think he's technically like a third cousin or something. Jesus. And one of them is actually Karl Marx's wife.
Well.
Through Scottish-German intermixing.
So you're a Luxembourg? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not. But I'm apparently way distantly related to them. It was weird to find that out. I was like, I'm related to to Karl Marx's wife because of a distant relation through a Scottish ancestor to a German aristocrat, that's fucking weird.
That's pretty insane.
But only Americans care about this shit anyway. All right, unless you're actually some kind of Habsburg or something, in which case I hope you fixed your jaw.
True.
All
or
right.
Rothschild, in which case,
Keep your mouth shut.
You're doing great. No worries.
All right. But if fascism triumphs, the tendency towards socialist freedom still must and will continue to reassert itself under fascism itself. Our note, under a bureaucratic slave society. There's a lot being conflated in that. Now, I want to point out that he is right to point out that German fascism, in particular, had slaves. Concentration camp members was corvée labor. That's effectively slavery.
Okay.
But it was not the dominant mode of production, even though it was used to supplement labor shortages during the war in German industries, and I also believe Italian industries.
Yeah, they had labor camps for sure.
Right. Well, the Italian fascists don't until they start siding with the Hitlerists, which is also a problem when we talk about fascism, because some things that are in like Spanish Phalangism and Italian fascism actually aren't in Nazism, and particularly the Hitlerist form of Nazism. So like it becomes even more conflated because we use the weird one as the standard definition because they kill the most people.
Yeah, I mean, the most effective form.
Right. All right. But like, he's also. This is where I get why certain kinds of even Trotskyists don't like him, because by saying bureaucratic slave society, he's also basically equating Stalin and fascism to the same kind of society.
Yeah, that's a dig. I wonder how he felt about gulags.
Right. This is a difference which is pointed to by the formulation of the historical inevitability of socialist tendency. By the way, also, like, the United States in 1947 still had corvée labor prisoners regularly. It's technically legal now, but most states do pay prisoners something. It's usually
like several cents.
Yeah, it's usually way, way below the minimum wage.
Unbelievable.
But, in this context, the tendency towards a slave state is a conjunctual tendency. So I find this interesting. Marx doesn't talk about a tendency towards a slave state. That's not Marx. That might be Trotsky.
Yeah.
That's not Marx. And again, Draper's not telling us on several of these things what text he's pulling from exactly, which I find frustrating because he was before.
Well, maybe that's here. Let me do a control F kind of moment to see if slave state comes up in any of those Trotsky quotes. No, we have totalitarian bureaucratic slave society in his own words in the beginning. Most graphically, so when the alternative to socialist victory is the slave state already outlined by the decomposition of modern society. So it's like implied.
Interesting, in a footnote, there is a debate with the councilist Paul Maddock in the back about the inevitability of communism. That's in a footnote. And I'm a Paul Maddock fan generally, although I'm increasingly kind of skeptical of it. Okay.
Yeah. And then slave state only comes back up,
I mean,
where we are. So there's like 3 references beforehand, but it's not clearly based in Trotsky, and it's going to come up more and more as we keep reading. I see.
Right.
Okay.
And it's also, he says the tendency towards socialism is going to emerge even within a bureaucratic slave state, which I'm like, where do you get that from in Marx, actually? Marx doesn't talk about that at all.
Sure. No, wouldn't you need capitalism first if we're going to be stagist from the slave state?
Right. Well, I think he thinks that like this is a regression, but he's not calling it a regression. But then why would the slave state develop into socialism? I know this is actually I will say from outside knowledge, I know that most Trotskyist organizations think there would be an internal revolution of the workers within either the deformed worker state or the collectivist bureaucratic state, or the state capitalist state, to reassert themselves through various forces, which makes their stance on the Cultural Revolution actually kind of interesting, right? Because that may arguably be an attempt to do that very thing of which they opposed.
Mhm.
But nonetheless, it is. I think this is a big problem. Like, I think like there's just like, well, we know that because Marx said we have to end up in socialism, no matter what happens. The tendency is ultimately towards socialism, and any deviation from that tendency that isn't human extinction is just a temporary setback. And I'm like, but why?
Right.
Like, I really like, you don't actually justify why. At no
It's
point
like
do you say why.
implied, but it's on an interesting amount of faith that I don't think you need to really have when you're coming at this critically.
It might be in the section that's next, which is called Inevitably Only Under Capitalism ?
Mm-hmm. Something
And
tells me
but
his answer to that in short will be no, nope.
Right. But so far he hasn't actually proven his point. Nor has he actually made a substantive distinction between an inevitable tendency and a conjunctual tendency.
Sure.
I think what he means,
and he puts
like,
conjunctural here in he's italicized it. He's emphasizing it. So
right.
it's
I guess
a particular combination of circumstances
of the
it's
shoes
the
that get
accidental type.
Right. Like, yeah. So it's the accidental type. You throw the shoes up and they don't come down because they get stuck in the tree limb. I guess that's what he's arguing. They still have a tendency to come down. Like, if the tree goes away, they're going to fall.
Yeah, or the tree's just going to rot eventually. And
But
then
how would you know in this scenario in a social history what is inevitable and what is conjunctural at all, if you're also admitting there are regressive tendencies in capital? Again, he's not calling them that. That I do think Trotsky would use that language.
Sure.
I know Trotsky used Bonapartism because he actually talks about both fascism and Stalinism as Bonapartist thing. And actually, Trotsky at the end of his life said that he would have been a Bonapartist figure had he ruled the Soviet Union. So
interesting.
That's Trotsky, because Trotsky thought that some sort of Bonapartism would have been inevitable since they didn't join up with the German Revolution, and thus had like Trotsky's basically admitting that like, since the Germans failed, the Russians were kind of boned. Maybe if you had a better Bonapartist figure, meet Trotsky, things would not be as bad. And then when the socialist revolution happened in America or somewhere else, then we could join up with it and things will be fine. But until such a time, we are like probably some kind of like worker state with a Bonapartist figure, probably the best we could have done. Now that's late Trotsky. Like, so, anyway, okay. So we have one more paragraph, and of course it's going to have, I love pre-1960s constant allusions to classical mythology. I do kind of miss that.
Anybody has any concept of what this could possibly mean nowadays, sadly.
It is Antusis, I think.
No.
Antius. Okay, I'm sure we'll find.
Greek
speakers, how do you say that?
They'll be like, oh, it's written in English, and why are you asking?
Shut up.
It's got that awesome AE stuck together thing.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
it is. Although it's not written that way here, but I think you're probably right. I think it probably is
It is that. It is that. I looked it up on the IPA reader.
Oh, cheater. All right. The Titan who dashed, someone actually did their homework as opposed to me. I know. Just read the essay a month ago and said, hey, let's read this. Or actually now 3 months ago. And I've forgotten half of why I wanted to talk about it in the first place.
You're like, this section I must have skimmed through.
there's a lot of these where I'm like, I know I read this, but I've read a lot between now and then, and we're coming back to it, and I don't remember why I thought this was important or not. And unfortunately, since I didn't agree to that we were going to be broadcasting on it, I am showing way too much of the recipe to the open channel. I didn't actually take notes the first reading. I just read it and was like, hey, I think we should talk about this before I get to some of the more famous Draper pieces.
It's a great article to read, I think, and I mean, not article, whatever, essay. I'm
I think
sure
it
by
was an
the end
article,
of
actually.
it, you're going to figure out why you
Well,
wanted to.
I know the
I've
basic.
been reading it in chunks for the most part. I read ahead a little bit, but I read close to the date that we film what we're reading. I take notes, I write questions, and I do some Googling.
I take notes when the day that we're reading it, I read it again and I take notes then. And if I know I'm going to be reading something for writing a paper, doing a show, I take notes the first time and then read it again and see if I agree with my notes.
Yeah.
Just as modeling for how people should maybe go about this. But if I don't know, if I'm just reading something for me, and I was on this big, like, I've been on for about 2 years, like, what did early socialists think about the inevitability of socialism? Because when shit gets referenced today, they tend to reference right before the new left forward, so 50s, 60s, 70s, not Second International, Third International, early Trotskyist stuff, because I think that stuff people are embarrassed by.
Sure.
So, like, Draper gets referenced all the time, but not these early essays. And I do think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to read this, because I'm like, we need to talk about early Draper. What's the
Definitely.
divisions in his thought? We already see, like, the whole bureaucratic collectivism versus worker state versus state capitalism. Actually hasn't come up yet, but it will later. That's already a big problem in 1947. Like, so, like, Trotsky's been dead for not that many years.
Sure.
Like,
Well, what isn't embarrassing the least about this is his grasp on like complexity theory before that's even popped up. He
yeah,
has some really interesting philosophical insights as
he's
well.
well read on contemporary philosophy of science, and we'll come back to that. That Morris Raphael Cohen reference would have been actually, like, fairly new stuff for a guy who just has a BA.
And he sprinkles in all sorts of, ancient classical history and mythology for some reason. I find this to be a very, very strange way to end this particular section, but so it goes.
Yeah. So who dashed the earth, comes back with the strength renewed from the contact with Earth, his mother. The Greek myth tells us that the Hercules finally vanquished him by holding him aloft in the air and strangling him. The ruling class society cannot do this to its Antaeus. For relations with the working class, it is both Heracles and Gaia, both its antagonist and its earth mother. Here too lies the historic inevitability of the socialist tendency.
How can you possibly talk about mythology and historic inevitability in the same sentence? There's nothing inevitable about mythology.
To me, this is like the constant allusions to Greek mythology is a Victorian and Edwardian and slightly after fetish, where, like, you're ending the period where to be an upper class gentleman you have to know the classics, but enough that people who are trying to affect that kind of thing, even amongst poor people, even when you're talking to them, you still have to do it as a way to just say, look, I'm learned. I know my fucking Ovid. Like,
yeah.
Like, and, this is not a time where you would have been expected to know Latin, right? But it is a time where you would be expected to know, like, classical mythology, which is part of why, for example, I just happen to know, like, when a lot of high school's humanities courses are actually kind of solidified, which is in response to German philology between World War I and World War II. That's why we teach stuff like Homer to ninth graders, even though I don't think it makes a whole fucking lot of sense to teach even a translation of Homer to ninth grader, because the Odyssey is friggin' weird.
It is weird. I did have like a very useful version of it that had kind of like notes at the top of each page, what was going on, just because it was so long. So I think I probably read mostly.
I've read several translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey at
Yeah.
this point in my life, and like I know the way I was taught the like I thought I'd read it because I read it in ninth grade, and then I
Yeah.
realized no, I did not. I read a few sections and watched a couple of movies,
Yeah.
and
There you go.
that's what replaced my knowledge of the Odyssey, which is like I know Scylla and Charybdis and the sirens and all this, and I know about Circe a little bit, and I watched DuckTales. For those of you who were not born in the 1980s, DuckTales was a Disney show
It was
that
awesome.
that was really kind of I remember it as being good. I remember a lot of things from the 80s as being good. Capitalist culture is deceptive like that. I've gone back and watched Thundercats and Silverhawks and realized that as a 6 and 7-year-old, I was actually tasteless. But
But I mean, it's interesting to contrast Thundercats to DuckTales. Like I was going to
yeah.
to say it reminds me of like something from more my era, although I also watched DuckTales. Wishbone. Do you
Oh,
remember
yeah,
that?
no. So, yes, when I was in ninth grade, my teacher put in Wishbone Odyssey for this, and it's one of my sources of memory for having read the Odyssey. When I actually read the Odyssey
That's
in
funny.
university, I was like, what's this weird frame story shit?
Yeah.
Like, why is it told out of order? Like, where are we at? Who's this Aeolus guy?
Yeah.
Like, and I just realized, like, oh, I read like a super abridged version which dropped the frame
Of course you
story,
did. Yeah, yeah.
and like,
That's really funny. My school was super intense about humanities actually, so we were like pretty deep into Greek um tragedies and comedies, and I got to read some cool, the frogs and stuff like that as well. But I don't know, I feel like I skipped over certain
I
sections.
read
I still
Oedipus.
remember answering on a quiz that asked who Clytemnestra was, and I said it was an ancient Greek STD. So there you go.
I read in middle school we read a prose version of Antigone,
Hmm.
and then in ninth grade we read the Odyssey as I'm recounting. We did not actually read it. And we read, I think, a shortened version, but one that was still a play of Oedipus Rex.
Yeah.
So, like, I did get that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, we read Oedipus as well.
I read the Bacchae on my own as an 11th grader. I have no idea why I decided to read the Bacchae. I got really
Changed your
obsessed.
life.
Well, it kind of did. I got obsessed with Dionysus. It's in my
I
email.
know.
And like, um, and then I read. That's actually why I read Nietzsche. I read Nietzsche in 11th grade, by the way.
Yeah, so did I, but not for that reason. That's really funny.
No, I got getting into this Apollonian Dionysian stuff because I read the Bacchae and I was like, I must understand this Dionysian stuff. And I also read this a German philologist named, oh God, what was his name? He wrote The Early Study in Dionysus. It's really interesting. And I read this in high school, and I can't believe I read this in high school. What is it? Who is it? Dionysus. Dionysus Myth and Cult by Walter Otto, which I read also in 11th grade. Like, I was a weird 11th grader. Like, I went to a university library, and like, and my mom was finishing up her degree at the time. I was like, how did I get a university library book? Like, oh
Yeah,
yeah,
you
my
got
mom
some
was finishing up
access.
her degree at a time. She graduated when I started college. I've told this story before.
Hmm.
And I like walked out and had her borrow this book for me, which is like I had her borrow a stack of Dionysus books. I just was weirdly obsessed. So yes, I got into German philology in high school out of boredom. I didn't even live with my mom at the time. That's the even funnier thing. Like, I would only see her a couple of times a month. But anyway, long story short, we're totally done with this 2 sections of the Draper essay, and now talking about bullshit. I'm going to leave the bullshit in because it's going to make us hit an hour, and maybe people will find this interesting.
Probably. Hey, what did you read or skip over in high school? Were
Yeah,
you interested in Dionysus?
say it in the
Or
show notes.
the name
Were
Baucus?
you a weirdo who read Nietzsche as a high schooler? Did it damage your
Probably. I
brain?
feel like 85% of the answers would be
I
yes,
feel like if you're a
absolutely.
certain kind of nerd in the 80s or 90s, that's actually probably pretty likely. I actually don't see it now. I don't know kids who read philosophy anymore, frankly.
No,
But like
I was reading like Kierkegaard and stuff in high school.
I got obsessed with this existentialist website that I found in my school library that also was a thing that I got obsessed with. And it started with like Sartre and Camus. I read
Mm.
Camus as a 9th grader. Like
Yeah, we had to read The Stranger.
you went to a better school than me.
I did.
I went to a Central Georgia public school. I found The Stranger. Oh no, I remember why I read it. My best friend was in an IB program at another school, and I read it to help her. She was also a grade up for me, but I read it to like help her study for it. And I again was like, oh, this is really interesting. I'm going to read all this existentialist because I feel
Yeah.
like it's like if you're again in the 80s or 90s and you encounter philosophy as a high schooler, you're probably encountering existentialism. That's like baby's first philosophical school, and you're
But not just baby, like angry teenage baby. The angsty baby.
angsty baby philosophical school. It's either that or Ayn Rand, which I also
Oh
dude.
God, I mean, he's internally angsty, but externally wears like, collared button-down shirts.
So let me tell you about Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, weirdly for the Objectivist Society, would give schools free copies of both The Fountainhead and Anthem. So my school had a shit ton of Fountainhead and Anthem because the Objectivist Society would just keep sending them more and more.
Yeah.
And so reread that in high school. And at the time, my response to it was like, this is like stupid Nietzsche. And also, like, this is like elitism, but also for everybody, but also dumb. And I couldn't quite tell you why it was dumb. Like, I was a 10th grader.
But you had the inkling back
I
then, at
had the
least.
inkling it was dumb. Like, it felt dumb. And so, yeah, this was, and I was also involved in zine culture back then. And you could see the little leftist and little rightist in my head like battle it out in like this 16-year-old kind of drug-addled mind.
Yeah.
That and I had, so for people go, oh, this is all cultural capital stuff. Absolutely true. But let me tell you why I was into it. I would read a lot because often I was couch surfing. I was kind of homeless in high school, and like reading and being at school was stable. So like I would spend a lot of time in the library because they didn't kick you out till 5. And then I would go to work, and then I would like call a friend and hope I had a place to stay that night. That was my life in high school. So I read a lot. Like, if I'd had cell phones, I probably would have ended up a moron.
Oh God. Yeah, I mean, yeah, if my mom could have afforded after school care, I wouldn't have spent all of my time in libraries either. Got to
Exactly.
go to the private school on a scholarship, but doesn't mean there was anything left for anything else. So I also spent a good chunk of my time reading.
Yeah, it's why when teachers
Look how I
who
turned out.
when I worked with teachers who be like, I don't get why these kids come to school and then skip, and I'm like, I do. You're boring.
Yeah.
And
What you're reading sucks.
And school is safe. And if they can sneak into the library, they can read what they want. At least they could 4 years ago. No longer true.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would always get so frustrated when like teachers would get mad at me for reading the wrong thing in class, and I'm like, I'm reading. Like, I don't know what your problem is.
Not a Playboy tucked away. Like, this isn't some.
It's not even a comic book.
No.
Like I got real bored, and I read all of the. I got really into like American modernism, not because I like American modernism, but because it was the new stuff in the textbook. So I like read the back end of my school textbook because I was bored.
That's funny.
And so like I read like all these American modernist short stories on my own because they didn't teach them to us. Like I got what 2 modernist short stories did I read? A Hemingway. I think it Hills Like White Elephant. I read Alice Walker, Everyday Use. We read, and Faulkner.
Interesting. Oh God, I still haven't read any Faulkner, which is
You
interesting.
haven't?
No, I have some here, I think, but we did have to read A Farewell to Arms, and I loved that book. And I was like, I went from going like, man, I hate this character, like I can't remember what her name was, Daisy or something, like the female,
Mm.
uh, his partner in there. But then I'm like, oh, so does he? He hates women. Now I understand why she sucks
But
so
then,
bad.
then
But it
you're
was
like,
a great,
oh,
it's
he
a
hates women
great
because
book.
he's been semi-castrated, and I'm sure like Matt Walsh will call this eunuch propaganda or something. But like,
Oh,
because
God.
in Farewell to Arms, he hates women, but he hates women partly because his own self-loathing, because he's sexually dysfunctional, because he got his junk blown off in the war.
Yeah. Also, she's lame. She doesn't even like to drink champagne. Come on, lady. Have
Yeah.
some fun. Gives me a
Also,
headache.
what is it
Makes me
with like
dizzy.
problematic women that people love hate in Lost Generation novels? Because is that like a stab at, did Farewell to Arms come out before or after The Great Gatsby? Because is that a stab
That's a good question. It
at
could very, very
Fitzgerald?
well be. That's maybe
Because
that's why I
Fitzgerald,
even called her Daisy, and it's probably not her name.
I was about to say Fitzgerald and Hemingway were frenemies.
Yeah.
So let me find out when that is. Let's see, Farewell to Arms, which I like, but also think is misogynist. But I tend 1929
Yeah.
and The Great Gatsby. I think that might
No,
even be
her
the
name is
same year.
Catherine. I totally just conflated those. That's really
Okay,
funny.
Great Gatsby is 1925. Um, yes, all the high school books. It's funny when Google gives me like all the standard high school books when I look up The Great Gatsby. It's like To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yeah, yeah, of
Catcher
course.
Fly.
You might be interested in, yeah, going through 10th grade
Jane
again.
Eyre. 1984. Grapes of Wrath. Oh my God. Old Man and the Sea.
The
Farewell to Arms.
Scarlet Letter.
I don't know why. At least most George Orwell and Jane Eyre are not American. So I'm like, nope, it's not even all American novels. Um, okay, we're really off topic. I'm going to leave this in because why the hell not? But we're going to wrap up. Happy whatever it is today. We're recording on Father's Day, but it's probably going to be released like a month and a half from now. So like, it's not relevant. But fathers, don't read Hemingway to your kids if you don't want them to be weird. All right. Good day.